Colourful Heritage itself is one of the largest South Asian heritage-focused, community-led initiatives in Scotland, charitable initiatives, I should say. And basically we have three aims, which is to capture, to celebrate, and to inspire others with the contributions of the South Asian and the Muslim communities that came to Scotland. So there's our aims there. And if you just look at the bottom, we've got our website here as well. And on this website, we've got a lot of our interviews, our stories, our edited interviews of the South Asian generation that have told their own story by themselves. And incidentally, this year being 2020, we are celebrating our 10-year anniversary. Only yesterday we've launched our Journey series. So, you know, log on to our Facebook page. We'll give you details about all of this at the end of the talk. So, and you can follow us on social media as well. So what I wanted to do was in the next few slides is to highlight some of the achievements and some resources that we have created in the last 10 or so years, mostly in the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years. So the first one being is our online video archive that I told you about. We've captured over 120 unique and, you know, fascinating video histories of these early folk that have come to Scotland over nearly 50 to 70 years ago. And it's basically their first-hand accounts by the participants themselves. So that's what makes it really interesting. It's people telling their own history by themselves. And there's the website there, just on this slide. And they share stories from the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, right the way through to migrating to Scotland itself, to working, family life in Scotland, and eventually settling in Scotland. And as I said, we have a new series called Our Journey that will be starting, and it will try and pick up on sort of short points on each of these little topics that I've talked about, you know, migration, family life, difficulties, challenges. I'll give you details of that later. But these stories are mainly in English language, and that makes it accessible for everyone to watch and learn. You know, they're from both men and women from Glasgow and from Dundee and Edinburgh. And what we ask them about is sort of four main key themes: migration, entrepreneurship or family life, identity, and a role of religion. So why is it that these oral video stories that we've recorded are important? Well, as I mentioned, there's a massive archival silence, so I wanted to capture this before this generation passed away. But more than that, it's a kind of advice and information that people talk about, you know, how do they overcome specific challenges? How do they deal with certain issues in their day? Because these issues will keep coming back, and we want to know how we can deal with it going forward as a community. And also, in order to engage the youth, we wanted to try and get these videos in English so that, you know, it's easier for the youngsters to understand. And we've put them on our YouTube channel as well. So I wanted to let them know how hard our forefathers have worked. Okay, so this is another resource that we have. It's the Bashir Man Archive. And we celebrate our achievements through this archive, which is launched at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow in 2014. And it consists of letters, photographs, and artifacts. Also posters, invitation cards, brochures, and they all belong to Bashir Man, who was Britain's first Muslim councillor. Now, I'll be talking about him a little bit later on. In the picture here, it shows Uncle Bashir Man actually looking at some of the artifacts in the showcase, which is in our exhibition, the Glaswegian Asians. And I'll just bring that up in our next slide now. Sorry, I was going to say that the archive itself is open to anyone. You know, you can access it. You can go and take a look, make an appointment and go in to take a look, especially for researchers going forward. But this is our exhibition that we've launched. It's called the Glaswegian Asians exhibition. And in 2016, Glasgow Museums and the Colourful Heritage team agreed to work together in order to highlight some of the contributions and promote the positive contribution of the community, the South Asian community, that came, you know, over 70 years ago. And the exhibition itself was launched in 2017. It's housed in Scotland Street School Museum, which is a really beautiful, marvellous Victorian building designed by the famous Scottish architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And the exhibition itself is located in the south side of Glasgow. So this museum is in the south side of Glasgow. very close to where the South Asians live nowadays, next to Pollock Shields. And there's 5 main themes on display. You can see this is the exhibition space here. I'm just going to circle around it here. And we have items on display related to entrepreneurship, contribution to World War I and II. We have a politics section, an education section, and a family and social section. And some of the main features that are on display are, we have select artifacts which are from both the community as well as Glasgow Museum's own exhibits. We've also got a number of iPads for display which show little mini video clips of the interviews that I was talking about before on various themes. And one of the nicest things that's actually there is this wall-sized timeline. I'm just going to highlight it here. It's a whole wall-sized timeline which shows different events at different points in time. And of course, we've also got our digital timeline on our website. So that's a much bigger, it's a more organic, it's growing all the time. So there's always entries added into that as well. So we also have another 3 themes on migration, integration, and identity, which are showcased in the various iPads. So we hope that everyone in the community, particularly youngsters, feel inspired by the contributions of the elders made. So this is somewhere where you can take your grandchildren, elders can go, obviously not with the current situation, but to see some more of this, you can log on our website and have a look at some of the pictures. There's a whole array of pictures online as well. So one of the other things Esther mentioned as well, we've also got an article in a chapter in a book called Scotland's Muslims, and this chapter is all about is on heritage, feeling Scottish and being Muslim, and it's actually all about identity based on the interviews that we conducted through Colourful Heritage. The various chapters in this chart, the lives and times of Muslims living in contemporary Scotland. It's printed by Edinburgh University Press. Okay. And one of our latest projects that we have is a recent resource that we've created for primary schools, in fact. And this is called a Digital Primary Schools Resource Pack. And it consists of 5 individual units. And you can see there's, we talk about Unit 1, about British Indian Army in World War I. We've got one in World War II, in particular Force K6 that were stationed in Scotland, escaped from Dunkirk, stationed here. We also have really this story of entrepreneurs in Scotland. How did they start off? What kind of shops did they have? And also political and civic contribution, as well as migration and identity. Now, this is a free resource for teachers and for educationalists to download. So anybody in the audience that has any connection, whether you let your children's school know or any teacher friends, do point them towards our website on the schools page where they can download this, particularly nowadays where there's going forward, everything's being digitized, so it's something that people can download for free. So when did it all start? Coming back to the contribution of South Asians in Scotland, when did it all start? South Asians have been in Scotland for a very long time. 1855 is when we have one of the first confirmed cases in Scotland that somebody's arrived, one of the first noted cases of somebody, recorded cases of somebody coming to Scotland. And if I just pull up the next slide, which is our digital timeline, this is just a snapshot of some of the events on the timeline. The timeline itself looks a bit different on our website, but that's the address for it here. So the first confirmed person that we have a record about is the Maharaja Dalip Singh, who's also known as the Black Prince of Perthshire, who was deposed from Lahore to Punjab, Lahore in Punjab, to the Grand Tully estate in Perthshire. And then you can see in the late 1800s, we've got Lashkars, seamen who've started to arrive at the shipping docks. They bring with them, they're working on the ships that are transporting things like tea, spices, tobacco, and many of them would be working there and traveling back and forth to India and back, and other countries as well. Some of them were abandoned by their, by the ships, so some of them decided to stay. So there was a small colony of them in Glasgow, in the port cities, around about 1860 onwards. And then we've got Mirbai Vakil. She was the first female graduate that attended Glasgow University. And we've also got, you know, around about start of the 1900s, we've got names of pedlars. Now these can all be seen at the Mitchell Library in the register. These pedlars arrived. Pedlars are, sorry, another name for door-to-door salesmen. They arrived at the turn of the century, and that was one of the first professions that the South Asian community took upon themselves. And here you can see a lovely picture of Celtic player Abdul Salim, who arrived from India. And these are just some of the entries that we've got, you know, on our website, on the digital timeline itself. And the digital timeline extends all the way from 1855 right the way through to 2020. So whenever there's something new, a new event, or, you know, something new, we try and incorporate that into the timeline. And it's specifically for the South Asian and Muslim communities within Scotland. So it charts our history, the Scottish history. So do check it out. So my next slide is about some of the pioneering pedlars in Scotland. What I've done is I've just tried to select a few people, because it's impossible to try and incorporate everybody into this this talk. I mean, this will just be the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the information that I'm going to give you has been either from the Bashir Man books. He has 3 books that he's written, and also testimonies from our interviewees. So a lot of the research is, you know, is come together after having interviewed. I'm one of the main interviewers at Colourful Heritage. So, and if you don't have interviews of these people, usually we've interviewed their children or even their grandchildren in some cases. So I will try and highlight in my talk some of the people that we have got interviews for as well, in case you want to go back and have a look. And again, there's more information on these people on our digital timeline. So I'll start off with one of the earliest folk that I know from the South Asian community that came to Glasgow. And that was, and I managed to find a little picture of him. In 1916, we've got Noor Muhammad Tanda. There's more information in this, in the Daily Record from 1967 about him and of you know, sort of Scottish Asians living in Glasgow around about that time. And he came to Glasgow in 1916 from a place called Tanda Ashrif. And he moved here for economic reasons and started working as a peddler, you know, door-to-door salesman. And he married, and all I know is that he married a Scottish lady called Margaret. And he does have nieces that are still in Glasgow to this day, you know, that still live here. So, you know, he has a family that's settled here. And then we move on to Mr. Atta Muhammad Ashraf. Now, he'll feature quite a lot in my talk. He moved to Glasgow in 1926, as early as this. And again, there's more information on him. There's an obituary, I think, on him in the Herald. He moved to Glasgow in 1926, and both he and Mr. Tanda, both of them together, decided to go into partnership and open a warehouse. And this warehouse was open in 23 Nicholson Street in the Gorbals. Now, I will show you a slide of this in my next slide, a picture of this warehouse in my next slide. But just to kind of finish off this slide, Mr. Yaqub Ali, who came to Scotland in 1952, also started as a peddler. I will talk about him and Uncle Bashir Man a little bit later in my talk as well. Both of them together were the best of friends. They worked together as peddlers. They worked in the community together. They worked for raising funds for the Glasgow Central Mosque later on. So they did a lot of activities together. Uncle Bashir Man is some of you will know, is UK's first publicly elected Muslim councillor. So I'll talk about these people in a little bit more detail later on, but just to show you the picture of the warehouse. So this is a Tanda Ashrif warehouse. This is an image of it from 1953. And you can see the picture shows a group of peddlers gathered outside, waiting to see somebody off who was travelling by road back to either India or Pakistan at that time. And this is one of the images that you can find in the Bashir Man archive. Now this warehouse, I've been told, and we have an interview of Mr. Fateh Ashrif's grandson on our website, Mr. Saqib Ashrif. He tells me that this warehouse was a hub for all the Asian peddlers in Glasgow. In fact, we even have an interview of his son on the website as well. Because it was a hub for everybody, that's where everyone gathered. All the peddlers would gather every day. Now, Mr. Ashrif himself lived upstairs in the flat above Nicholson Street with his family. And so at 4 o'clock, they would gather, they would socialise, they would play cards, they'd play games, they would have tea, and this would be sent by Mr. Ashrif's wife, who lived upstairs. So she would send down tea with some homemade, sweetmeats or some goods and some kind of food for the peddlers. And when they gathered there, not only did they socialise, but they also shared their peddling experiences with one another. How did the day go? What was it like? What was a good patch? What wasn't? They would also get advice and discuss housing matters, with one another as well, and other work matters. And very often, now this is a really interesting bit, very often Mr. Tanda and Mr. Ashrif would give the peddlers items of clothing, and usually it was things like undergarments, socks, cardigans, tablecloths, away with them in good faith. And this was to try and help their fellow countrymen, because they own the warehouse, but this is how they helped these people to start off in business, to start off in their working life, to give them a hand. And so they only got payment once the peddlers would sell the goods. So in essence, essentially, Tanda Ashrif Warehouse acted as a mini bank for the early community. Another thing to note about this particular picture is the kind of dress sense of these peddlers. In the 1953s, you can see they're all very well dressed, suited booted, they've got the trousers, the sort of jackets, trench coats, and some of them are even wearing their hats, with their ties on, so they're looking the part. They're really trying to fit in. Normally they would be wearing their traditional outfits, had they still been in India or in Pakistan at the time. So another person I wanted to highlight, I don't think the talk would be complete without this, is Mr. Fateh Sharif, who was a community helper. He's somebody who's related to Mr. Fateh Ashrif, and he arrived from a village called Mardarpur in India. And during my interviews with people, he gave a helping hand to the community in many ways, very often by lending them money, and most often by usually buying them a ticket, to be able to go back to their home country. Also by physically helping them, either with repairs around the house or taking people to hospital appointments, and also as a translator. He was a real sort of community person that people looked up to. And of course, when somebody would pass away, he would be the first point of call for people to, he would console the family and make funeral arrangements as well. So the picture on the right shows when he was given the honour to dig up the foundations, the starting foundations for the Glasgow Central Mosque in the late 1970s. So here are some more early pioneers. And these are people that have still got businesses in Glasgow today. So we've got Haji Sher Muhammad, who was part of 5 brothers. He was the second eldest. He's the founder of the Sher Brothers Empire, which some of you will recognise. He came from a village in Faisalabad and arrived in UK around about 1936. And then what he did was save some money. He worked as a peddler, saved some money, and called over his brother, then called over another brother, then his eldest son. And they opened up in 1951, they opened up their first Shea Brother Cash and Carry in 55 Gorbals Street, which is where the Central Mosque stands at the moment. So, he had all his brothers joining in the business, apart from one that stayed in Pakistan. Now, Mr. Nehar Singh Rakra, he's somebody who travelled to Glasgow in 1947, and to this day, he's presently one of the oldest working entrepreneurs in Glasgow. It still goes to his work, goes to his warehouse at the age of 93. He's born in a village called Badwal in Punjab, and he trained as a tailor. So what he started to do was manufacture goods. He also had a warehouse in Nicholson Street. He started to manufacture goods, and he sold it to the peddlers and also to the Tanda Ashrif warehouse and to somebody like, people like Fateh Sharif that I've mentioned. And another person that comes up in the talk is somebody called Sheru Ram. These are all people that had warehouses in Nicholson Street. And then we've got Uncle Muhammad Tufail Shaheen. who happens to be also the father of Baroness Nushina Mubarak. I'll come back to her later. But he arrived in 1958 on his way to Canada, and eventually just decided to stay in Glasgow. Never actually made it to Canada, just decided to stay here. He was instrumental as president of the Glasgow Central Mosque Committee, you know, when the committee was first started, before the mosque was started to get built. He donated a warehouse in Carlton Place, in fact, to use as a mosque after the first mosque was knocked down in Gorbals. He also had a really big cash and carry along the River Clyde in the late 70s, and to this day he's helped to set up a charity called Glasgow the Caring City, which helps disadvantaged children in Glasgow. These are just some of the pictures of the cash and carry for the Shear brothers in the early days. Clayland Street, Gorbals Street and Clayland Street corner in Gorbals. And this is Shaheen Cash and Carry, just there here at the corner there as well. This would have been their sort of maybe second ventures. Okay, somebody I wanted to highlight, which is quite important, is a gentleman called, it was the late Nawab. He's the owner of D&D Cash and Carry in Glasgow that was built in 1982. He came to Glasgow in 1954, and up until this point, cash and carries were mainly converted buildings, converted spaces. So often they were very tight spaces, they were dangerous buildings, they were old buildings. So along comes Nawab, and he came from a village or Chak 109 in the area of Chichavatni, in the district of Sahiwal. Couldn't speak a word of English. He was completely illiterate, apart from, you know, speaking, maybe writing in Urdu, but he couldn't speak any English or write any English. And the story has it that he had a piece of paper with his friend's name, which he used to get to Annette Street in Govanhill, and he would shout out until his friends came down to get him. So he used to have a converted warehouse, D&D, in the late 70s, but then decided that he wanted to build a new place. So he was the first person to build a custom-built cash and carry, and that's an artist impression of D&D cash and carry 1982, before 1982, which is now currently known as ABS cash and carry. And this is an image of him with his wife Darcy Dean. He wanted to improve the customer experience and introduce proper till points, same level shopping, designated storage space of goods, you know, provide easy customer car parking. So all of this, it was something that he had a vision of, you know, and he was very good at his business. He was very quick-minded, even though he didn't speak the language, but he knew how to do business. And that's what led to the first purpose-built cash and carry. Now, his life story is shared on our website by his daughter, Ria Dean, so do check it out. The next person we've got, I've mentioned him before as well, is Mr. Yaqub Ali. Again, didn't speak a word of English, arrived in Glasgow in 1952. His brother was here a few years earlier than him. He started to work, he arrived with just a few pounds in his pocket, you know, and started to work as a peddler. Could only read and write basic Urdu, no English, but yet these people went on, you know, people like him and Nawab went on to build their own cash and carries. And the special thing about him is he built Europe's largest cash and carry called Castle, employing hundreds of people. You know, we've got nearly 250 people that he employed, great turnover. And in the 1980s, he made a very large, substantial donation, £250,000 in the late 1980s to Strathclyde University. And that was the single largest donation given to any educational institute at that time. He also helped with the Central Mosque construction, was part of the committee along with Fateh Sharif and Bashir Man. And what I'd really like is if anybody knows any more information or pictures of him, or, you know, in particular any pictures of Castle Cash and Carry, or would like to share anything with me, then do get in touch on our email address. It'll be at the end of the talk as well. Love to hear from you. Another really fascinating thing about Scotland is we have claimed to have invented the chicken tikka masala in the Shish Mahal restaurant in 1970. And many people actually started to open up restaurants having worked as peddlers, or even on the buses, I must mention, which was a big part of working in Glasgow. You know, without the South Asian community, the bus transport the transport system would not have continued on because there were so many of us that were, you know, working as conductors and drivers. But then they went on to open shops and restaurants. And so, in fact, one of the UK's most popular dishes was invented by this gentleman here, Mr. Ali Ahmed Aslam from Shish Mahal. This is based in the West End of Glasgow. And it was created after a customer complained that it was too dry. So the dish, chicken tikka, was too dry. So he went ahead and made a gravy or a masala and added it to the chicken tikka. And thus, chicken tikka that we know of today, and it's the nation's favourite curry nationwide, was invented. Okay, so now we move on to another area on education. I've mentioned to you before about Mr. Fateh Ashrif. This is his son, Dr. Ibrahim Ashraf. Now, he's one of the first South Asians to be awarded an MBE in 1963. Now, he's one of the first South Asian children to have come to Glasgow and who was enrolled into a school to study. So his father called him 10 years after he arrived, called him in 1936, and he was in Allen Glen School. He then went back to Pakistan, studied there at Faisalabad Agricultural University, did his honours degree there, and then decided to come back after partition in 1948 to Glasgow, and then enrolled at Edinburgh University to study his PhD. In 1955, he joined the British Foreign Service to a research facility in Gambia, and in 1963 he was awarded an MBE. He was what we know about him is that he's the first South Asian to be awarded an MBE in Scotland and possibly even in the whole of UK, for having written a dictionary in several languages, in particular in a language called Mandingo. And this helped the other British Foreign Service people when they travelled over to the research facility where he's also got some papers published related to the research that he did in that facility. And this medal and the research papers can be seen at the Glaswegian Asians exhibition on display. So it's a fascinating story, you know. So we've got his father, then we've got his son. And I'll come back to his dad later on a little bit. So coming to politics now, Scotland's first South Asian town councillor was in 1936, a gentleman called Dr. Janti Das Sagar. He arrived from a village called Deharo and came to Dundee in Scotland and went straight into year 2 of medicine at St Andrews University, and finally graduated as a Bachelor of Medicine. He made history when he was the first South Asian and coloured town councillor in 1936. In 1956, when he passed away, Dundee City Council actually named a street after him called Sagar Street, which still stands to this day. And in 2019, last year, to mark 100 years since when Janti arrived in Dundee, the University of Dundee released some scholarships on his name. So he's one of the first councillors. The next slide shows some of the more political firsts in the UK from Glasgow. We've got a slide here of Uncle Bashir Mann being raised on shoulders of his colleagues just outside city chambers. And he came to Glasgow from the village of Man in Gujranwala. He was educated, university educated, but again he started working as a peddler because there's no jobs available at that time. And from very early on he was involved in helping people in his community. And he made history in Scotland because he made history in the whole of UK by becoming UK's first Muslim Justice of Peace in 1968, and then first Muslim councillor in 1970. And he was publicly elected to represent the former Kingston ward in Glasgow. This was predominantly a white Scottish ward, so it wasn't as though it's just the South Asian people that voted, it was the Scottish people that had voted for him. He was very heavily involved in setting up Glasgow Central Mosque, along with many others. And he held very high positions of responsibility from very early on. He was Deputy Chairman of the Commission for Racial Equality, Chairman of Glasgow Central Mosque, Deputy Lieutenant for Glasgow, even Convener of Strathclyde Police Board. And he was also President of Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations. He was a very big advocate for people to get engaged and play their part in all aspects of civic life. And he eventually wrote 3 books about Scottish South Asian history in Scotland. And then if we go forward, just under 40 years later, UK's first Muslim MP is also from Glasgow, and it's this gentleman here, Mr. Mohammed Sarwar. He arrived in Scotland in the 1970s, and he became the first Muslim MP in 1987. And he took an oath on the Quran, which is now actually on display at the Glaswegians exhibition, which is currently over 250 years old. He's presently the governor of Punjab in Lahore. And what's really interesting to note is both these major political achievements were achieved by the small South Asian community in Glasgow. We're talking less than 2% of the entire UK's South Asian population. So rather than, somebody from, you would expect that from somebody from down south, maybe Manchester, Birmingham or London, where there's more of a South Asian community, a larger community. So the pioneering achievements of both these men have opened the doorway for many future, participation in politics. We've also got Scotland's first female South Asian police officer, a lady called Saranjeet Matharu. She came to Glasgow at the age of 5 and wasn't able to speak any English at all, but she always knew she wanted to become, a police officer because she wanted to help her community. And what's really interesting to note about her is she became bilingual very quickly, but she was selected not long after UK's first ever female Asian police officer in 1971, and that was down south in England. So 1974 is not that much behind. So we were always, I feel that the Scottish community were always just right there. We weren't that far behind anything that was happening down south. So we're, breaking barriers, pioneering in many ways. And some other people we've got here is Mrs. Khanda Chaudhry. She was the first Muslim female GP in Scotland in 1994. And then Mr. Shaheen Tafel's daughter, Baroness Nashina Mubarak, she became a member of the House of Lords in 2014. Another lady I'd like to really highlight is Mrs. Bridge Gandhi. She came from Kenya in the 1970s, and she developed a lot of interfaith work, helping pupils and religious educators, especially at St Mungo's Museum in town. In 1992, she helped to open a centre called the Meridian Centre, which was where, ladies from the Asian community could go along to get educated and for support, whether to find training or to find jobs or for applying for jobs. And in 2005, and so that was one of the first centres actually opened in Glasgow. And she's believed to be one of the first South Asian women to be awarded an MBE for her fundraising for leukemia and obviously for her work in empowering women involved in Meridian in 1992. So I want to just quickly talk about Glasgow's first mosque and gurdwara pioneers. Now you see pictures here. We've got Mr. Fateh Sharif here again, that came in 1926, who helped to, set up the constitution, the Jamiat al-Muslimin, and also along with others, helped to buy one of the first converted mosques in Glasgow. Now the next slide will show a picture of that. We've also got Mr. Jeevan Singh Pal, who came to Scotland in 1941-42, but was based down south prior to this. And he's also helped to set up the first gurdwara in Glasgow. And both these gentlemen, their grandsons, have given stories and testimonies about, what their lives were like. And again, this can be found on our website. So Mr. Tanda Ashrif and Mr. Gurdev Pal, their stories. So this is an image of the first mosque in Glasgow in 1944 that was purchased. So along with Mr. Fateh Ashrif, 7 other people contributed about £100 to try and buy this building. And the downstairs of it was also owned by the mosque, and it was the Indian Seamen's Club, where the Lashkar, the seamen, they would get together and socialise and get together. And upstairs there would be the mosque just there on the first floor, and above that they also rented out the flats. So they actually bought the whole building, but they rented out the flats on the top 2 floors. And Mr. Tanda's nieces and their family, they lived in some of these tenements at the top. After this mosque was knocked down in the Gorbals, a second mosque was created, again a purpose-built in Carlton Place by Mr. Shaheen Tafel, who donated the premises before the central mosque was built. And in the picture of this gurdwara, you can see very high ceilings. This was actually on the top floor of a tenement in 79 South Portland Street, again in Gorbals. And Mr. Jeevan Singh Pal, with the help of his son, Mr. Puran Singh Pal, and some friends such as Lal Sharma, and another one I should mention is somebody called Ajagar Singh Chal, and others, they set this gurdwara up. So along with many, you know, they bought the top floor flat again. I think it was from a Mr. Khan that they purchased the flat and they converted it into a gurdwara. And since then, there have been several buildings converted to use in gurdwaras. And there's also the Male Malap Centre, which was established in 1995 in the West End. So just to show you where we are nowadays, this is the first purpose-built mosque in Glasgow, and it's this Glasgow Central Mosque, built in 1984. And in 2013, we've got the first Gurdwara in Albert Drive, Guru Granth Sahib Sikh Sabha. Today, we've got over 60 mosques and places of worship in Scotland, including places like Al Mizan, which is a women's only institute, established in 2005, approximately 2005 by Mrs. Salma Sheikh. Her interview is also on our website. And this Gurdwara here, the head teacher that teaches the Punjabi classes in this in this particular building is we have her interview featured as well on our website, Mrs. Diljit Dilbar. So just to conclude, I'd like to finish off to just say that these men and women are just some of the early pioneers. You know, there were loads more, you know, many more to touch upon for today. And there have been countless others, you know. Mainly they came from the Punjab region in Pakistan and spoke very little English. However, this very small community lived and worked together alongside one another in the south side of Glasgow mostly. And they achieved so many firsts in business and, you know, in religion as well. So they forged an identity for themselves. So what that shows is that the integration experience for Scotland South Asians is markedly different. It's, you know, very different to and positive compared with the experience that England would have had. Each and every one of them came to Scotland to help improve their own lives, and eventually stayed in Scotland because they enjoyed living here and working here, and, you know, they felt they had more opportunities here for them and for their family, and they worked extremely hard to contribute to Glasgow, Scotland and beyond, and to make Glasgow and Scotland their home. So I'd like to finish off by thanking everybody for attending today and for your attention.